All right, Studio 4, this is take 10. Cue Jim Bartlett.
Thanks, Bill. On February 5th, 1971, Apollo 14 landed on the moon's surface. At the controls of the lunar lander was Derry, New Hampshire astronaut, then Commander Alan Shepard. This past April 15th, now Captain Shepard returned home, and New Hampshire rolled out the red carpet for its spaceman. Following an appearance before the state legislature in Concord and a spectacular parade in his hometown of Derry, Captain Shepard was honored at a testimonial dinner in Bedford, New Hampshire. At that testimonial dinner, Derry paid homage to its space hero. Captain Shepard, in return, paid tribute to his very special guest by narrating a 22-minute, first-time-ever-shown film of the historic space flight of Apollo 14. Today on Take 10, we'll be taking that approximate 500,000-mile round-trip journey to the moon with Captain Shepard and his crew, astronauts Stuart Roosa and Ed Mitchell. Though I'll have to ask you to use your mind's eye in some cases to visualize some of the film sequences he'll talk about, I felt it was a golden opportunity for you and I, as well as residents of this area, to get a little bit closer to our man on the moon, Captain Alan Shepard. And I think you'll agree that few of us have ever had the privilege of being guided on a personal round-trip tour to the moon, and especially by one of those who have actually gone there. Today we'll take that trip with the personal guidance of Captain Alan Shepard, as he describes his reactions and responses while making the round-trip journey. One thing you're sure to notice is that Captain Shepard has a keen sense of humor as he describes this historic mission. The flight of Apollo 14 literally got off the ground on January 31st of 1971.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff with Apollo 14. 3 minutes past. Beautiful.
This starts with the takeoff of Apollo 14, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, and 6.5 million pounds of spacecraft, launch vehicle. Goes off very slowly with a tremendous roar and vibration, smoke. And there's no question about the fact when that baby lights off, you're on your way.
5 seconds now into it, and we can still see a bright, bright flame. Huge tongue of flame. The word from the astronauts, all going well. Now, plunging into the clouds, we've lost sight of the Apollo 14, but you can hear it. There's the thunder of that mighty 30...
Very positive thrust and a very positive control. Of course, here, since so much of the fuel had been burned out, we were actually accelerating at a very high rate of speed, and we were being pushed back into our seats, back into the couch, with an acceleration of about 5 times our actual weight.
Not long after Apollo 14's crew took off, the lunar lander and the mothership attempted a docking maneuver, and that docking maneuver at first failed. For a seemingly endless period of time, it looked like the Apollo 14 flight to the moon would have to be aborted.
Well, now, perhaps some of you recall that we had a problem, and as you may know, the thing didn't work the first time.
It is certainly a serious problem in terms of the mission itself. However, it is not that consideration in terms of crew safety at this time. We're at 3 hours, 54 minutes, continuing to monitor. We show Apollo 14 at 12,481 nautical miles away from Earth, and this is Apollo Control, Houston.
Well, we had a little fun with our boss. We came back, and of course he was most anxious to know what had happened, and he said, well, what was the problem with the docking probe? And we said, well, we'd heard our television ratings were going down, so we thought we'd create a little excitement. We wrote our own script.
Okay, that tells us right there that the capture latches are indeed cocked, and that kind of says that there's something in there that's keeping us from releasing them when we go ahead and dock. And it says we cannot fire a bottle.
You'll see it go on in and bounce right back out again. What you can't see is a look of dismay on 3 faces inside the command module. There's a little jiggle. It was a very good approach, and of course that added to our dismay because we couldn't really figure out what had happened. And as Stu puts it, being a good fighter pilot, he gave it more throttle and rammed it in again. And this time you can see a jolt, shiver, and quake go through, and I said, don't hurt it, Stu, we may need it later on.
Following several tries, the ship and its lunar lander made it and docked perfectly.
After several attempts, We finally did make the docking successfully, and it appears now what happened was a little piece of metal had become embedded there and temporarily prevented the mechanism from working, and finally later was shaken out.
And thus it was on to the moon. I'm Jim Bartlett, and today on Take 10, we're taking an unusual trip to the moon with Derry, New Hampshire's own space pilot, Captain Alan Shepard. Lunar orbit has now been achieved, and Captain Shepard and his Apollo 14 crew were encircling the celestial body, the moon, some 238,000 miles away from Mother Earth. And soon the moment of truth arrived, and the lunar lander and Terry separated from the mothership and headed downward toward the surface of the moon.
It's very difficult to tell how far you are above the ground because of the lack of familiarity with the known objects. One thing I want you to notice in this sequence, though, is we're coming toward the edge of the shadow on the moon, what we call a terminator. And notice as we do that, the shadows get longer and longer. And just before we come, there's a terminator coming in from the top. You'll see right in there is where we landed, in that area.
And then the historic landing. Captain Shepard, at the controls, takes us in.
We're coming pretty close to a stop, and I've started to descend down toward the surface. You can see the dust increasing, and right about there's a shadow. Right there is touchdown, the engine goes off, and the dust settles down, and you have just landed at Fra Mauro on the moon.
Once on the surface, the astronauts rest up for several hours and then step out onto the moon's surface.
Okay, Al, beautiful. We can see you coming down the ladder right now. It looks like you're about on the bottom step. And on the surface. At Bedford, old man.
Okay, you're right. Al is on the surface, and it's been a long way, but we're here.
One of the first things we did, of course, was to put up the American flag. I might add, perhaps redundantly, that there's no other flag up there on the lunar surface right now.
Once on the moon's surface, several experiments were conducted and equipment set up as those of us here on Mother Earth, through the miracle of television, watched live and in color.
Now, the surface is really a very light, mousy gray, as we call it. Here again, the green is just in the developing process. It's very hard to get the true representative colors.
2 days later, and takeoff from the moon. Astronaut Shepard and Mitchell lifted off toward the mothership. Again, Captain Shepard describes the experience.
You know, I was mighty glad with that engine lights, I'll tell you, because that's the first step toward home. We took off, went into orbit around the moon, and then for the first time around the moon, we tried one of our old Gemini rendezvous tricks, that is a direct approach rendezvous. We refired for a second time the ascent engine, the big engine of the ascent stage, and effected our rendezvous totally and completely before the command module had gone 3/4 of the way around the moon. So it was a very fast, rapid rendezvous, and one which worked right on the money. We came right up the pipe, as we say. Well, you can see what a wild place that moon is. It just looks like nothing you've ever seen before. Just one crater after another. Ed and I, of course, are in there. We were awfully glad to get back. Now, once Stu had finished his little maneuver here, then I closed on in closer, and then I pitched 90 degrees, so the top of our heads were actually aimed at the command module. Yeah, I'm flying on in there now at the moment. Those are the windows, by the way, in the bottom. That's what Stu is kind of upside down here to us. But of course, it doesn't make a difference when you're weightless like that. Your feet are always down, regardless which way they're pointed. Now here we've pitched over. Again, in the upper right-hand corner this time, you see the cone through which the docking mechanism will operate. And there's the target right there, just about in the center. This time we come right on in and latch, and everything works perfectly. Right here, the two vehicles are drawn together, and the latches are firmly made up.
And now the long trip homeward bound. Some 2 days later, and the three spacemen began re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere.
minute 20 seconds after entry. About coming up now on the maximum G forces, 6.2 Gs at this time.
Fireball re-entry.
And we're about 2 minutes from end of blackout.
Kitty Hawk now burning, blazing, fireball. 24,600 miles an hour, being slowed to only 7,000 miles an hour at the 27-mile high altitude when they come out of this blackout. Heat shield blazing at 5,000 degrees now.
Tremendous speeds and heat in which this, see the spacecraft comes crashing back in at 25,000 miles an hour, and the stagnation temperature in the center of the heat shield is 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
And then, with re-entry completed, the 3 chutes open, and Commander Shepard and his fellow astronauts, after speeding through outer space, now drift slowly earthward and splash down.
This is the best sight of the whole trip. You can see there's the command module, good old Kitty Hawk, and 3 beautiful parachutes.
The astronauts are back home again, and the world sends up a cheer as the flight of Apollo 14 has been a complete success. Later, astronaut Shepard remarked when asked if return trips were in the making. He replied, "Well, there's plenty of rocks left up there." As the day came to an end, the space hero showed his humble side as Captain Alan Shepard said thanks to Derry, New Hampshire, and those who had made his return home a proud and memorable moment.
Listen, it's been a long day, and I won't talk anymore except to say that in all seriousness, it's been a tremendous day for me. We've had I think, a most warm reception, excluding the elements. Certainly the warmest that Louise and I have had since we started our little trip around the country. And tonight I want to thank you very much for the kind words you said about me and my family, and for these gifts that you've given us. In closing, I would like to say only one thing, and I alluded to it this afternoon, but passed it hurriedly because it was a little chilly. But one thing I've noticed is that the majority of the astronauts have come from small towns. As a matter of fact, the original 7 astronauts all came from small towns. And I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a head shrinker, I'm just an engineer, and I don't know really what the ingredient is. I guess if we did know, perhaps we could bottle it and everybody could make a fortune selling it. But somehow, somewhere, in this kind of background, a small town background, there's an ingredient that at least makes for successful astronauts. And whatever it is, I thank you all for it.
Thanks for joining me today on a very special trip to the moon with Captain Alan Shepard. This is Jim Bartlett, and that's Take 10 for today.
All right, Jim, that's a take. Let's wrap it up. Take 10.
The preceding was pre-recorded.